It started with a distress signal, a faint, fragmented cry for help lost in the static void of space. The crew of the Helios Dawn, a deep space salvage ship, had no choice but to answer. It wasn't just protocol, it was curiosity. The transmission had come from the Eidolon, a long-lost research vessel presumed destroyed during an asteroid field breach years ago. No one expected it to be drifting in orbit around a dead planet, its hull intact but cloaked in eerie silence. Captain Mara Valen led the team aboard the derelict ship, her resolve masking a growing sense of dread. The corridors of the Eidolon were a labyrinth of flickering lights and frozen shadows, the air thick with the metallic stench of decay. Signs of a massacre were everywhere, claw marks gouged into the walls, blood trails leading to sealed doors, and yet, no bodies. The Eidolon's logs were corrupted, its systems barely operational. What little data they could recover spoke of an experiment, a biological breakthrough that promised to rewrite the limits of human evolution. But something had gone wrong. Horribly, irrevocably wrong. Then they found the first body. Or what was left of it. The thing wasn't dead, at least, not in any way they understood death. It was fused with something organic yet alien, its limbs grotesquely elongated, its eyes hollow pits of writhing flesh. The moment the team drew near, it sprang to life with an inhuman shriek. Its body moving in unnatural spasms. It tore into their medic, Kalen, with claws that shouldn't have existed, ripping him apart in seconds. The crew opened fire, but the bullets only slowed it down. It took a plasma cutter to the spine to finally stop the thing. What the hell is this? Gasped Engineer Derek, his voice trembling. Mara had no answer. The creature wasn't human anymore, if it ever had been. But it wasn't the last. The deeper they ventured, the more of these monsters they found, some humanoid, others amalgamations of flesh. These grotesque parodies of human form, the creatures weren't random. They were purposeful, almost sentient, working together to corner the crew. Mara realized too late that the Eidolon wasn't just a derelict ship, it was a breeding ground, an incubator for these necromorphs. Whatever experiment the researchers had conducted had unlocked something primal, something ancient buried beneath the surface of the dead planet. The necromorphs were the result, a hive mind of reanimated, mutated corpses driven by an insatiable hunger for new flesh to assimilate. One by one, the crew fell. Each death was worse than the last as the necromorphs adapted, growing stronger, faster, more cunning. Derek was taken while trying to seal a bulkhead, his screams echoing through the ship's vents. Talia, the pilot, tried to barricade herself in the control room, only to discover the creatures had already burrowed through the walls. The sound of her panicked breathing cut off abruptly, replaced by the wet crunch of bone. Mara was alone now, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind fraying at the edges. She stumbled into the ship's main lab, the source of the nightmare. There, she found the marker. It was beautiful and horrifying, a towering monolith pulsating with an otherworldly glow, its surface etched with cryptic symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when looked at. This was the cause of it all, a relic of incomprehensible power that the researchers had unearthed. They had tried to harness it, to unlock its secrets, but instead, they had unleashed a plague. Mara's mind buzzed with whispers, her vision swimming with hallucinations. She saw her fallen crew, their faces twisted in anguish, beckoning her to join them. The marker was alive, its influence spreading through her veins, threatening to consume her. She had one choice left. With trembling hands, she activated the Helios Dawn self-destruct sequence, linking it to the Eidolon's end. The marker had to be destroyed, along with everything it had infected. As the countdown ticked away, the necromorphs descended upon her. She fought with every ounce of strength she had left, her plasma cutter carving through the abominations, but there were too many. They swarmed her, their claws tearing into her flesh as the timer reached zero. The explosion lit up the void, erasing the Eidolon and the marker in a blinding inferno. But as the debris scattered into the infinite darkness, a faint signal flickered to life, a new distress call emanating from another ship. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Mara's consciousness flickered as if caught between two planes of existence. She should have been dead. She felt dead. Yet, she awoke to suffocating darkness, her body bound to a cold, unyielding surface. Her muscles burned, every nerve screaming as if her flesh had been shredded and stitched back together. Panic surged when she realized she couldn't move, her arms and legs restrained by biomechanical tendrils grafted into her skin. Dim light bled through the cracks of the massive chamber. Organic, pulsating walls surrounded her, dripping with a foul, viscous fluid. She wasn't on the Helios Dawn anymore. The explosion had failed. The necromorph hive had adapted, absorbed her into its grotesque ecosystem. And now it was reshaping her. The first cut came unexpectedly, a serrated blade. Surgically precise, slicing through her abdomen. Mara's scream echoed into the chamber, only to be met with an answering cacophony of alien shrieks. She looked down to see metallic appendages, their spindly, insect-like joints working with terrifying efficiency, pulling her skin apart to reveal sinew and bone. She struggled, every muscle convulsing, but the tendrils tightened their grip, sinking deeper into her flesh as if savoring her pain. A figure emerged from the shadows, a twisted hybrid of human and necromorph. Its face was a hollow mask, its eyes replaced by glowing orbs that bore into Mara with malevolent intent. This thing had once been human. Now, it was something else entirely, a harbinger of the hive's cruel intentions. It spoke, or perhaps the hive spoke through it, its voice a guttural chorus of torment. You will become us. You will see the truth. The blade returned, peeling away her fingernails one by one, each agonizing pop accompanied by a flood of blood and nerve-searing pain. The creature tilted its head, studying her reactions, feeding off her agony. It wasn't just torture, it was experimentation. The hive wasn't satisfied with consuming her, it wanted to understand her, to break her will and transform her into something far worse. The organic walls shifted, revealing other victims, crew members from the Eidolon and perhaps even others from ships lost to the void. They were suspended in grotesque poses, their bodies partially fused to the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes moved, following Mara, begging for release. But there was no escape. The hive fed on them, repurposing their flesh and pain to fuel its endless evolution. The figure leaned closer, its clawed hand slicing into her chest. Mara gasped as it began to carve symbols into her skin, the same cryptic markings that adorned the marker. Her vision blurred, her mind fracturing as the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They promised her release, power, and unity with the hive. All she had to do was let go, but Mara wasn't ready to surrender. Summoning every ounce of strength left, she wrenched her head free, biting into the tendrils holding her. The metallic taste of alien blood filled her mouth as she tore through the restraints. The hive screamed in rage, the walls convulsing as if the entire structure was alive. Mara ripped herself from the operating table, her body a ruined tapestry of blood and exposed muscle. She stumbled forward, grabbing a jagged shard of metal from the figure lunged at her, its claws aiming for her throat. Mara drove the shard into its chest, twisting it with all her might. Black ichor sprayed across her face as the creature howled, its body collapsing into spasms. The hive reacted violently, the walls erupting with tendrils and claws, but Mara pushed forward, driven by pure survival. Her path led her to the core of the hive, a pulsating mass of organic and mechanical horror. It radiated power, its surface teeming with necrotic growths that writhed like living veins. She knew this was the heart of it all, the source of the nightmare. With trembling hands, she activated a plasma charge salvaged from the debris she'd passed. The timer blinked to life. Counting down, the tendrils struck like vipers, slicing into her legs and pulling her back. She screamed, swinging her improvised weapon, severing one appendage after another. The hive's screeches grew deafening as it realized her intent. It unleashed its remaining horrors, necromorphs of every form, grotesque amalgamations of flesh, metal, and torment, descending upon her like a tidal wave. Mara fought with feral desperation, her body breaking under the relentless assault. Claws shredded her arms, Teeth sank into her shoulders, and yet she pushed forward, dragging herself toward the core. As the timer reached its final seconds, she slammed the charge into the pulsating mass, locking it in place. The explosion didn't just destroy the hive, it obliterated it. The shockwave tore through the ship, vaporizing everything in its path. The screams of the hive were silenced, replaced by the cold, indifferent void of space, and then, silence. Mara's battered body floated amidst the wreckage, her breath shallow, her vision fading. She had won, but at a cost too great to bear. Her last thought, as the darkness claimed her, was a bitter hope that no one would ever find the mark. But far away, on another desolate planet, another faint distress signal began to blink. She woke up gasping, her lungs pulling in stale, metallic air. The taste of blood lingered on her tongue as she realized she was lying on a cold, pulsating surface. Her body throbbed with pain, her arms and legs were bound again, but this time by something tighter, something alive. Tendrils coiled around her limbs, burrowing into her skin. The hive had survived, and now it was rebuilding her, reshaping her into one of its grotesque creations. A searing pain ripped through her abdomen. Mara screamed, her body arching as alien claws sliced her open. She watched in horror as her organs were pulled out. One by one, each nerve ending screaming with unbearable agony. Her blood didn't spill to the floor, it was absorbed by the walls, which pulsed brighter with each drop. The hive wasn't just torturing her, it was feeding on her, thriving on her pain. Figures began to emerge from the shadows. They weren't human anymore, but she recognized them, her crew. Derek, Kalen, Talia, all of them were now part of the hive. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and their bodies were contorted into twisted forms of sinew, bone, and metal. They moved jerkily, like puppets on strings, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. They approached her, their claws glinting in the dim, organic light. Derek was the first to strike, his arm elongating into a jagged blade that slashed across Mara's chest. She screamed again, blood spraying as her flesh was flayed open. Talia followed, her fingers transformed into needle-like appendages that punctured Mara's shoulders, pinning her to the surface. Kalen leaned in, his jaw unhinging to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. He whispered something incomprehensible before sinking his teeth into her neck, tearing at her flesh. Mara's vision blurred, but her mind remained sharp. The hive wanted her to stay conscious, to feel everything. Every slice, every puncture, every bite, it was orchestrated to keep her teetering on the edge of life and death. She realized with a sickening clarity that this wasn't just torture. The hive was studying her resilience, pushing her body to its limits to see how far she could go before breaking. The walls around her shifted, revealing rows of other victims suspended in grotesque displays. Some were partially consumed by the hive, their bodies fused with the walls, their faces frozen in eternal agony. Others were still alive, writhing and screaming as necromorphs tore into them, their limbs being twisted and repurposed. The hive was a factory of torment, endlessly creating and consuming. A sharp, blinding pain brought Mara back to her own suffering. The tendrils around her limbs tightened, pulling her arms and legs apart until she thought they would tear from their sockets. Her screams echoed through the chamber, blending with the cries of the other victims. Her body convulsed as more tendrils burrowed into her wounds, pumping something cold and alien into her bloodstream. She felt her muscles seize, her veins burning as the hive began to transform her from the inside, but Mara wasn't ready to give up. Even as her body betrayed her, she searched for something, anything she could use. Her eyes locked onto a jagged shard of metal embedded in the wall nearby. Summoning every ounce of strength, she wrenched one arm free, the tendrils ripping chunks of flesh as they resisted. She grabbed the shard and drove it into the tendrils around her other arm, slicing through them in a spray of black ichor. The hive screamed, the walls shaking as if in rage. The necromorphs lunged at her, but she was faster. She slashed wildly, severing limbs and piercing grotesque bodies. The ichor sprayed across her, burning her skin, but she didn't stop. She tore through her restraints, her body trembling from the effort, and stumbled to her feet. Mara's gaze landed on the core, a pulsating mass of flesh and machinery that radiated a sickly glow. She knew it was the heart of the hive. If she could destroy it, maybe she could end this nightmare. She staggered toward it, fending off the necromorphs with the shard. They clawed at her, their shrieks filling the chamber, but she kept moving. Reaching the core, she plunged the shard into its surface. The hive let out a deafening scream, the walls convulsing violently. The necromorphs froze, their bodies spasming as if disconnected from their puppet master. Mara twisted the shard, pushing it deeper, and the core began to rupture, spraying a torrent of black fluid, but the hive wasn't done. Tendrils shot out from the core, wrapping around Mara and dragging her closer. She struggled, the shard still in her grip, as the core opened to reveal a gaping maw lined with razor-sharp teeth. It was going to consume her, make her part of it forever. With a final, desperate scream, Mara drove the shard into the maw, splitting it open. The core exploded, sending a shockwave through the hive. The necromorphs collapsed, their bodies disintegrating into ash. The walls began to crumble, the entire structure imploding. Mara fell to the ground, her body broken and bloodied. She crawled toward the exit, the hive collapsing around her. Just as she reached the airlock, the hive let out one last piercing shriek, and the entire chamber was engulfed in flames. She didn't know how she survived. As she floated in the wreckage, her body barely holding together, she realized the fight wasn't over. The hive might be gone, but its whispers lingered in her mind. She could feel it, still inside her, waiting, and somewhere in the void, another marker began to glow. Mara's world was a blur of pain and fire as the remains of the hive burned around her. Her body screamed for release, but it wasn't finished with her yet. She staggered to her feet, blood drenching her, but the excruciating ache in her limbs didn't subside. There was no relief. Her bones felt as if they were cracking under the strain, each step a torture in itself. Her mind was fracturing, but the whispers, the vile, insidious whispers, kept gnawing at her thoughts. Then, in the twisted silence, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of scraping metal against bone. It was distant at first, but soon it grew louder, closer. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She turned sharply, eyes wide with fear, but her body didn't have the strength to react. A pale figure stepped from the smoke and debris, its limbs contorted unnaturally, its skin stretched tight over exposed bones. Its face was a grotesque, malformed mask of someone she thought she knew, Kalen, her old crew member, his eyes now completely hollow. He limped forward, dragging his broken leg behind him, the tendrils of the hive still rooted deep in his chest. His mouth opened, releasing a stream of liquid that dripped down his face like a sickening cascade of blackened bile. His gaze fixed on her, vacant, yet somehow knowing. She could see it in his twisted grin, the hunger that remained in him, though he was no longer human. Before she could even react, his claws shot out like spears, tearing through the air with an unearthly screech. They sank deep into her flesh, raking across her ribs, pulling out hunks of her flesh as though she were nothing more than meat for his consumption. She screamed, her voice raw and desperate, but it was cut short when one of his claws found her throat, digging in deep, forcing blood to spill down her chest. Mara tried to push him off, but her hands were weak, her body shaking uncontrollably. She could feel the heat of the flames creeping closer, and the pressure on her throat intensified as his claws twisted deeper. The blood poured faster, flooding her chest, and the pain exploded in waves, each second worse than. Kalen's mouth opened wider, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. He lunged at her neck, biting down with a sickening crunch. The agony was unbearable as his teeth punctured her carotid artery. Blood flowed from the wound, and she could feel her life force draining away with each brutal suckle. The hive was taking its toll, each of the creatures was a reminder of what she had narrowly escaped. Her hands clawed at him, her fingers slipping in the slick blood as she tried to pry him off. But it was no use. With every passing second, her strength ebbed away, and she could feel her vision dimming. Her body was shutting down, succumbing to the violence. to the torture that had become her life, but just as she felt herself slipping into darkness, something inside her snapped. A deep, animalistic scream tore from her throat. In a desperate surge of energy, she grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage nearby and shoved it into Kalen's side. The sound of bone splitting was almost drowned out by his horrifying screech, but she didn't stop. She twisted the metal shard, driving it deeper into him, until his body shuddered and went still. For a moment, she lay there, gasping for air, blood spilling from her body, but the whispers didn't cease. They were louder now, echoing in her skull, scratching and clawing for her sanity. They spoke of power, of transformation, of becoming one with the hive. But she wasn't ready to give in. Summoning the last remnants of her strength, she pushed Kalen's lifeless body off her and crawled through the debris. Each movement was slow, painful, and filled with excruciating discomfort. She could feel the fire closing in, the heat scorching her exposed skin. Yet the deeper she crawled into the wreckage, the more she realized there was no escape from what had been unleashed. The hive was still alive, its tendrils reaching into her mind, pulling at her, breaking her apart one agonizing piece at a time. The ground beneath her buckled as something massive moved beneath her. The walls trembled with a low, guttural hum, like the heartbeat of some vast, insidious creature. She looked up and saw it, an enormous, grotesque version of the necromorphs she had fought before. Its body was a grotesque fusion of machinery and decayed flesh, its limbs unnaturally long and spindly, with serrated claws that scraped the floor as it approached. The creature's eyes glowed a fiery orange, and Mara could see that they weren't just eyes, they were watching her, studying her every movement. The thing tilted its head as if considering her, its mouth opening in a jagged grin of sharp, glistening teeth. A guttural growl escaped it as it reached for her, its claws stretching out to drag her back into the heart of the hive. Mara didn't think, she acted. Her hand grabbed the first weapon she could find, a bloody, twisted piece of rebar, and she swung it wildly. The metal cracked against the creature's skull, but it didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, its claws inches from her face. She swung again, her body shuddering from the effort, and this time, the creature staggered back. But it was only momentary. The massive thing hissed, and its claws plunged into her side, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. The pain was unbearable. Her body screamed in agony, but she wasn't done. With one final surge of strength, she drove the rebar deep into the creature's chest, twisting it as far as it would go. The beast howled, its grip loosening as it crumpled to the ground, writhing in its death throes. But Mara knew it was only a matter of time before something else took its place. The walls seemed to pulse around her, the hive growing stronger, feeding off the violence, the pain, the suffering. It was a never-ending cycle, one she couldn't escape. And with each passing second, she realized there was no victory, no triumph. She was trapped in this living hell, and nothing, not even death, would set her free. As her body gave in to the overwhelming pain, she closed her eyes, but the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent. Mara's breath came in ragged gasps as she pulled herself through the ruins of the wreckage. Her body was a patchwork of cuts, bruises, and broken bones, each movement a new wave of torment. The pain didn't seem to stop, it was endless, as if the universe itself was punishing her for surviving. But survival was a fleeting hope, and she knew it. The very air felt thick with the stench of death, the remnants of the creatures still lurking, waiting for their next victim. The ground trembled beneath her, and she felt the familiar weight of something monstrous approaching. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The nightmare had already begun. Her legs shook beneath her as she forced her body forward. But the sound of heavy breathing reached her ears. It wasn't her own. The growl reverberated like thunder in her chest. She stumbled forward and collapsed, her hand scraping against the cold metal. The sharp edge of a piece of rebar dug into her palm, and she gripped it like a lifeline, pulling herself to her feet once more. The growl was closer now. She could feel it. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat growing faster, each breath more labored. The thing was coming, and it was coming for her. A low hiss sounded, like a snake preparing to strike. She spun around, raising the rebar in front of her, but it was too late. The creature lunged from the shadows, its jagged teeth snapping. Its claws like serrated blades. She swung the rebar with all the strength she had left, but the thing dodged with terrifying speed. It was on her in an instant, knocking the weapon from her hands and sending her sprawling to the ground. Her body collided with the cold floor, the impact sending a jolt of agony through her spine. The creature's claws raked across her chest, tearing through flesh and muscle with ease. She screamed, the sound strangled and raw. The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the look in its eyes, those black eyes that seemed to feast on her fear. Before she could react, the thing was on top of her, its claws sinking into her abdomen. She gasped as the searing pain overwhelmed her senses, but it wasn't enough to make her give up. She wasn't ready to die, not like this. With what little strength she had left, she reached out and grabbed a shard of metal from the wreckage. It was sharp, jagged, and covered in blood. She thrust it upward, plunging it into the creature's throat. It screeched, a horrendous sound that filled her ears, but it didn't stop. The thing kept coming, relentless, its grip tightening. The blood was pouring now, hers, the creature's, a mix of agony and death. The creature's body convulsed, thrashing violently, but it didn't release its hold. Mara's vision blurred as she struggled for breath, the air growing thin, suffocating. She couldn't fight it anymore. Her hands, slick with blood, slipped from the creature's flesh, and she could feel the coldness creeping into her limbs, but the creature didn't let go. Instead, it pulled her closer, its teeth snapping, its jaws widening as if to feast on her very soul. It was a torture worse than anything she had ever known. The pain wasn't just physical now, it was in her mind, in her very spirit, as if the creature was trying to devour her entire being. Then, just as it was about to sink its teeth into her neck, the ground beneath them shook violently. The walls groaned, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. The creature froze, its attention suddenly diverted. It hissed, pulling away from her with unnatural speed. Mara, gasping for air, watched in horror as the creature's form seemed to distort and change. Its body twisted, and in the blink of an eye, it became something else, something even more grotesque. The creature's head stretched and split open, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Its limbs lengthened, the skin tearing away to reveal blackened, writhing tendons. It was no longer the thing she had fought moments ago. It was something worse. Much worse. She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. The pain was too much, the blood loss too great. She lay there, helpless, as the monstrous form loomed over her, its tendrils reaching down to drag her into the depths of the hell it had come from. But then, another sound broke the silence, a scream. It was guttural, primal, and it sent a chill down her spine. The creature paused, its head snapping toward the source of the noise. Mara didn't have the strength to look, but she felt the shift in the air, the sudden tension, as if something else was coming for them both. The creature hissed again, its tendrils twitching, and in that moment, Mara realized what had happened. There was another one. The other monster appeared from the shadows, just as twisted, just as monstrous. This one was even larger, its skin a patchwork of torn flesh and dark, pulsating veins. The two creatures circled each other, sizing each other up, their eyes burning with hunger. But Mara knew there was no escape. She was trapped between them, and her blood was like a beacon in the night. They weren't here to fight each other. They were here to feed. And she was the prey. In a final, desperate attempt, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the rebar she had dropped earlier. With a final burst of energy, she grabbed it and thrust it upward, catching the first creature in its exposed underbelly. It screeched, thrashing in agony, but it didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. The second creature lunged, its jaws snapping as it closed in on her. The two monsters collided with a force that shook the ground, and Mara's world exploded into chaos, her vision with blood and pain. She couldn't tell who was winning, who was feeding. She couldn't tell what was real anymore. All she knew was the darkness that had claimed her, the darkness that had come to take her soul. As the monsters tore each other apart around her, she realized, with horrifying clarity, that there would be no escape. There was no salvation. Only death. The world was spinning, blood and screams. Mara's body felt like it was being shredded apart by invisible claws, every movement a searing bolt of agony. Her vision was fogging over, but she could still hear the sickening, wet sounds of flesh tearing, bones snapping, and the guttural snarls of the monsters as they fought over her remains. Her chest was heaving, desperate gasps of air pushing against her ribs, but every breath was like inhaling fire. She had to move. She had to escape. The rebar was still in her hand, slick with blood. But she couldn't feel her fingers properly. It was like they were no longer her own, disconnected from her mind. Her limbs trembled, not from weakness but from the raw fear coursing through her veins. The creatures were locked in a brutal struggle, their monstrous forms writhing and crashing into walls with terrifying force. Their claws tore into each other's flesh, tearing open massive gashes, spraying thick, black blood that coated the floor in a pool of horror. But neither creature was backing down, each relentless in its pursuit of dominance. Through the chaos, Mara's eyes flickered to the side, where another piece of debris had been flung aside. The shadows cast by the flickering lights revealed the dim outline of something small, a way out. Her mind screamed for her to move, to fight, to live, but every inch of her body was against her. The pain, the unbearable pressure on her chest, the raw stench of blood, it was all becoming too much. She crawled, inch by excruciating inch, each movement sending sharp jolts of pain through her body. The floor was slick with blood, and her hands slipped as she clawed her way toward the small gap in the debris. She had to get to it. She had to, but her strength was failing and shattered the air. It wasn't one of the creatures, but something even worse. The second monster, the one she hadn't seen coming, had shifted its attention back to her. Its eyes were wild with hunger, its mouth stretching impossibly wide as it reached for her, its claws dragging across the metal floor with a sound like a knife being dragged across stone. Mara's heart pounded in her chest as the creature's claws dug into her back, dragging her away from the gap she had been desperately trying to reach. It hissed in satisfaction as it slowly began to drag her back into its lair, its teeth glistening with malice. The pain was unbearable. She could feel the claws sinking deeper into her flesh, tearing through her muscles, feeling her skin peel away from the bone. Her mind was screaming. Her body was on the brink of collapse, but survival was a fire burning deep inside her chest. She wouldn't die like this. Not at their hands. With a strangled cry, she lashed out, slashing at the creature's face with the rebar, the metal scraping against its unnaturally thick skin. It screeched, an inhuman wail that tore at her eardrums, but it didn't relent. Instead, it shoved her back down, pinning her beneath its monstrous weight. She could feel the hot breath of its hunger on her face, the stench of death and decay suffocating her as it brought its mouth closer to her neck. Everything was happening in slow motion, like time itself was warping to trap her in this nightmare. She knew she couldn't win. But she had no choice. With one final, gut-wrenching scream, she drove the rebar upward into the creature's exposed throat. The sound of metal scraping against bone was sickening, and for a moment, the world went silent. The creature's grip loosened, and Mara, her strength spent, collapsed against the cold, unforgiving floor. But as the beast's body collapsed into a heap beside her, its black blood staining her skin, she realized the other creature, the first one, was still alive. And it was angrier than ever. She could hear it moving, its jagged claws scraping against the floor, each step bringing it closer. She turned her head, the blood pooling beneath her, and saw the creature's eyes lock onto hers. There was no mercy in its gaze. No fear. Just an unquenchable hunger. It was almost to her, its body lurching forward with unnatural speed, when a loud crash echoed through the room. The walls shook, and the very foundation seemed to tremble beneath her. The ground split open, the floor buckling, and a blinding light pierced through the darkness, temporarily blinding her. The creature froze for a split second, just long enough for Mara to push herself to her feet. Her vision was a blur, but she saw the light. The light meant escape. It meant survival. With everything she had left, she threw herself toward it. Her body screamed in protest, but she refused to stop. She wouldn't let them win, the creature hissed, its claws scraping against the metal as it followed her, its steps gaining on her with each agonizing second. She could feel its hot breath on her neck, feel its presence growing nearer. But the light was almost within reach. She could see it now, a small crack in the wall, the faintest sliver of hope. With one final push, she dove through the crack, her body scraping against the sharp edges, tearing her skin further. She tumbled through the hole, falling into a dark, damp corridor. But it didn't matter. She was free. She was alive, for now, she could still hear the creature's roar, echoing through the walls, but it was fading. Slowly, the sound of its fury disappeared into the distance. Mara pulled herself to her knees, blood dripping from her body as she stared down the dark hallway. There was no telling what lay ahead, but she knew one thing, she wasn't done yet. She wasn't ready to die. She rose, her body shaking but determined, and took a step forward, toward the unknown, behind the monsters that had nearly torn her apart. There was still a chance. There was always a chance. As long as she kept moving, as long as she kept fighting, she might just survive. Mara's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she stumbled through the dark corridor, the walls around her a blur of shadows and blood. She could still hear the horrible screeches echoing from the depths of the building, the creatures, those cursed things, hunting her down like prey. The sharp scrape of claws against concrete reverberated through the tunnel, every sound a reminder that she wasn't safe, that they were still coming. Her body was battered and broken, each movement causing her to wince in pain. Her skin was torn in places, raw and bleeding from the savage attacks, but the fire of survival burned fiercely inside her chest. She refused to die in this hellhole. The faint light from a distant exit sign flickered ahead. It seemed impossibly far, like an unreachable dream, but it was the only hope she had left. The only path to escape the nightmare that had become her life. As she dragged her aching body forward, she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of scraping claws on metal, closer this time. The creatures were still relentless, still hunting, their terrible eyes searching, their hunger insatiable. One of them must have broken through, and it was catching up, her vision blurred with exhaustion. But she could still feel the presence of the beast behind her. The air around her grew colder, and with it, the scent of death filled her nostrils. Her heart pounded, thumping violently against her ribcage, every beat filled with terror. She couldn't let it catch her. Not after everything. Then, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, rang through the corridor, another creature, closer. She cursed under her breath and quickened her pace, every step a painful reminder of how broken she truly was. She reached out, clutching at the walls to steady herself, her fingers slick with blood. The exit was near. She could almost taste it, but the air was thick with the scent of death, suffocating her. The scratching of claws was now followed by a guttural growl. Her heart skipped a beat, and she pushed herself harder. The door was in front of her, just a few more steps. With a cry of desperation, she reached for the handle. Her hands, slick with blood, fumbled over the cold metal, but it was no use. The door was locked. Her mind screamed in panic. She couldn't go back, not to those things. She had to get out. The growls from the creatures grew louder, closer. She heard the thud of their steps against the floor, the terrible sound of their twisted bodies moving faster. Their claws scraping against the stone walls. Mara screamed, her voice a raw, desperate thing as she slammed her fist against the door. Nothing. It wouldn't open. And then she saw it. The small vent at the top of the door. It was barely visible, hidden behind a rusted metal panel, but it was enough. It was her only chance. She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her legs as she climbed the wall. Her fingers scraped against the rough concrete, tearing into her skin, but she barely felt it. She was too focused on the vent. With a final, painful lunge, she grabbed hold of the vent's frame, pulling herself up and forcing it open with a sickening screech of metal. A burst of cold air rushed into her face, and for a split second, it was the only thing she could feel, the only thing that mattered. She scrambled through the opening, her body aching, but she kept moving. She didn't stop. She couldn't. She crawled through the narrow shaft, the air thick and musty. It felt like an eternity before she reached the other side. When she finally tumbled out into the open, she was met with a cold, merciless wind. But she didn't care. She was out. Her body collapsed onto the hard ground, her face pressed into the dirt as she gasped for air. The night was silent around her, but the fear, the adrenaline, still burned through her veins. She slowly lifted her head, the ground spinning beneath her. She had made it, but just as she began to allow herself a moment of relief, a distant screech echoed from the depths of the building. It was faint but unmistakable. They were still alive. The creatures, the necromorphs, still hunting. Mara knew then that it wasn't over. The escape, the relief, had been an illusion. They would always find her, always chase her. The night wasn't safe, the world wasn't safe. It had become a never-ending nightmare. A game of survival that had no end, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. She pushed herself to her feet, shaky but determined. The monsters could scream and howl, they could try to hunt her down, but she was a survivor. And she would do whatever it took to stay alive. As the faintest glimmer of dawn began to break over the horizon, Mara turned her back on the building, on the monsters that would never stop, and walked away into the unknown. For the first time, she felt free. But freedom was fleeting. Survival wasn't about escaping, it was about staying one step ahead, and that's exactly what she would do.